All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. This is week 6 of our Unknown Legends of, somebody popped in, let me let them in, of our Unknown Legends of New Orleans music. I really want to I really appreciate Dave and Charles for, doing something different. And in the case of definitely some of these going very in depth and to really find that something that was very different and interesting. And Dave, thank you so much for doing this. I hope you enjoyed learning about these guys. I was blown away by Clarence Williams. I was blown away by last week's Latin influences, and you hit the nail on the head about all the things that Charles is going to, talked about, which he did, and then even talked about more that I had never even heard of. So these are really are, something that we're going to offer to people later on and say, if you're interested in this, we're going to be able to share these with you. And so you're going to be able to watch them later on. So we don't expect these to be going anywhere. And, Dave, there's probably many more we need to cover, don't you think?
Right, but after a pause.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to give you an idea, Dave, a nice break. So the Friends have their member lecture series. As always, these are free to members. But we have, starting next week, we have Bill Capo doing his book Category 5 and he'll be talking about his experience steering Hurricane Katrina. August 31st, Deep Delta Justice with Matthew Van Meter. And then we take a week break for Labor Day. And then we have Bananas, Quarantines, and the Octopus, United Fruits Company's PR stunt in Central America with Emily Perkins of the Historic New Orleans Collection. But just to tell you, we have lectures booked all the way through December 14th of this year. So we've got plenty of options. So if you're not a member, become a member for only $40 and you can get access to all of these lectures. So today we're going to be talking about Spencer Williams, and I'm very excited to learn more from Dave on this. So with that, I'm going to welcome Dave Thomas, local tour guide, historian, musician, and really is a great presenter on these kinds of musicians to come bring them out of out of the deep shadows, and they should be out in the open for all of us to learn from. So Dave, thank you so much, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks everybody for coming. I'm happy to talk about Spencer Williams with you. I always like to preface these things just by letting people know I'm just a tour guide and a musician, and that's where my interest this comes from. I like doing music tours, music history tours. So I'm not an academic. I'm not very deep in stacks and research on these people. They're just really interesting. Spencer Williams, fascinating guy. A songwriter who really, I guess we'd say from the early jazz period, although his legacy survives to this day and very, very strongly to this day. I'm guessing almost everybody on the Zoom session has never heard of Spencer Williams, and there is no doubt that you have heard of his music, probably multiple songs, not just a few. Part of his early history is kind of a little hazy or steeped in legend, maybe is what we should say. And that's partially his doing. He liked to spin some stories about his origins. So that's where we're going to start with just testing people's knowledge a little bit of his early life. So this is a true false section to start off the thing. So I want to know, true or false, was Spencer Williams born in New Orleans? And you can just put that in the chat, what your guess is. So I got a yes and a true. Nope, sorry. These are probably going to be some gotcha questions. All right, so his mother supposedly was a prostitute in Storyville. What do we think? Got a false. Yep, that one's false too. How about his aunt was the notorious Madam Lulu White of Mahogany Hall fame? How about that one? I know that's a puzzler. How are you going to go on that one? I got a yes. That actually is true. And he went to live with his aunt in Mahogany Hall when his mother died when he was in a very young age. What do we think about that one? Yeah, sounds like a good story. Well, it's false, but there's a kernel of truth to it. And as you could expect, we're going to explore that. So why do we care about Spencer Williams? Well, he was a prolific songwriter in the jazz era, 1920s. He's got about 200 copyrighted songs. And if you go to the discography of American Historical Recordings, which I love to reference and love to check out, there's over 500 recordings listed there. And these primarily deal with 78s and typically go up, I think in Spencer's case, they go up to about 1949. And there's a lot of recordings of his stuff after that. And the fundamental reason is everybody knows his songs. Everybody. I mean, everybody. We're a little bit more interested in him from where we live because of his New Orleans connection and influences. Song themes are in a lot of his music, New Orleans themes in a lot of New Orleans iconic performers have really wrote his songs. And there's a continuing legacy of his songs, both in recording and performance. His songs are still a part of popular culture. So let's start at the beginning like I usually do. He was not born in New Orleans. He was born in Selma, Alabama. And that's important, probably born in Selma, Alabama in October 14th, 1886 or thereabouts. Because the lore that he spun was that he actually was born in New Orleans. His father was Spencer Sr., born into slavery, had been a railroad worker and a cook. Mother was Delia Amanda Henley or Hendley. Sometimes it's spelled with a D, and there is no evidence that she was involved in prostitution in Selma or in New Orleans or anywhere. He was raised in Montgomery, Alabama, and he had an older sister, Bessie Williams, who died in 1961. And this is an important part of biography because a lot of the popular stuff you see cited about him, they cite his mom as Bessie Williams, and she's the one that they said died when he was young and why he wound up living in Storyville. So there was a Bessie Williams, but it wasn't his mom, and she didn't die young, clearly didn't die young. He did have a relative, Lulu Henley or Hendley, and most likely she was the aunt, his aunt, the sister of Delia, so his mom. Possible she was an older stepdaughter of Spencer Senior, but really it looks like Delia's sister is the most logical explanation. He did have some New Orleans in his history. Maybe it's from the years 1902 to 1907. He went to New Orleans, not to live, probably maybe spent summers there or lived for extended periods there. And he did appear to have stayed with his aunt, Lulu White. And Lulu White was the professional name, the working name of Lulu Henley. And of course, she was the notorious madam for Mahogany Hall on Basin Street, one of the most opulent brothels at the time of Storyville. There's a transom that was one of the few things that were salvaged from Mahogany Hall. It was torn down, and the location now, it's 235 Basin Street. The location there, I think, is still an electric car shop. I don't know if it survived the pandemic or not. It will. It was an electric car shop. Lulu White also had a saloon on the corner of Basin at Bienville. That lower right picture is a vintage picture of the saloon. And you can see a hint of Mahogany Hall off to the left, the staircase and the vertical section of windows. And then to the right behind the saloon, these are former cribs from Storyville. And then way down here on the right, just peeking out, is a hint of a bar that had been known as Frank Early's My Place Saloon. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The second story of the saloon was blown off in Hurricane Betsy, but the first floor is still there, and that's the picture in the lower left. It's actually a grocery store. So that is one of the few buildings that is left from the days of Storyville. So he was there from 1902, 1907 for extended periods, and through the 1910s, he also made frequent visits. When he was there, he cited two specific influences, piano players, Tony Jackson and Albert Carroll. Albert Carroll is a lesser known kind of an obscure piano player. Tony Jackson has a pretty good reputation. He's probably what most people would know him for is he's the author of composer of Pretty Baby. But he was considered to be the best piano player in Storyville. I have read no contemporary descriptions, so descriptions of him by his contemporaries, that did not identify him as far and away the best piano player in Storyville. And he was also said to have a really good singing voice. So he was influential on Spencer Williams. And the building that's pictured at the lower left, that is the building that used to be Frank Early's My Place Saloon, that we just saw a hint of in the earlier photo. It's at the corner of Bienville and what is now Crozat, and it's had a strong association with Tony Jackson. Played there, may have lived upstairs, and may have actually lived upstairs when he wrote Pretty Baby. There is a third building that is also left from the Storyville days. They're the only three: Lily White Saloon, Frank Early's My Place, and one back on North Villery that's called Was Joe Victor Saloon. And interestingly enough, the three buildings we have left, they're all grocery stores right now. He goes to Chicago around 1907, 1908, gets a job as a Pullman porter, and within a few years has some success as a songwriter with a song that he published as I Ain't Got Nobody Much. It had been floating around for a few years between 1911 and 1914. There were earlier versions and composers under I Ain't Got Nobody. And he published it in early 1915 with lyrics by Dave Payton. And then a guy by the name of Roger Graham got a hold of the publishing. And when he published it in 1916, he changed it back to I Ain't Got Nobody, and he wanted to get some composition credit. So he essentially claimed to have written the lyrics and credited the music to Williams and Payton. And that's probably not right. It was probably the first publication that was more right. And they get a hit fairly early on by a woman by the name of Marion Harris. That's actually her up in the upper left there. And this song has legs. It really goes on for a pretty good life. Marion Harris has multiple recordings, the first 1916, another one in 1920, I think another one in 1923, might have been others after that. Virginia Liston, who was an early blues performer, she records it. Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, the woman who was the most popular and the highest paid Black performer in the 1920s, she recorded it. Fats Waller multiple times. Earl Hines records it. He was a band leader in the early swing era, and he was the piano player on the second set of Louis Armstrong Hot 5 and Hot 7 sessions in Chicago that really launched Louis Armstrong's reputation. And in particular, he was a piano player on West End Blues, which is probably the most iconic recording of those sessions. And then Louis Armstrong himself, he recorded it in 1929. Of course, the reason we know the song is because of that guy, Louis Prima. He actually put it together with another song called Just a Gigolo and then added I Ain't Got Nobody. And it became, I think, the reason we all know that song. Yeah. Dancing is allowed for this presentation, by the way. The woman that was singing with him there, that's Keely Smith, one of his many wives. So this pasting together of Just a Gigolo and I Ain't Got No Body became so established that a lot of times after that, that's what people recorded or covered instead of just I Ain't Got Nobody. The most high profile one was David Lee Roth. He was the lead singer for Van Halen, had a kind of a brief solo career. And I think this was his signature song from that period, Just a Gigolo and I Ain't Got Nobody. And there's even a really cute MTV video that he did, a little over the top, but it's kind of cute. And you can check that out on YouTube if you want to. And then these other people also recorded the song. When he's in Chicago in 1917, he also writes a song called Tishomingo Blues, probably a reference to Tishomingo, Mississippi, where some relatives lived and that he went to visit when he was a kid. It didn't really establish itself until 1928 when Duke Ellington recorded it. So you're probably listening to this and going, geez, that sounds kind of familiar. And this is why it may sound familiar to you.
I smell the pine trees, I look around for you. Oh, my sweet, sweet, sweet old someone.
That's exactly right. That is Garrison Keillor. He used Tishomingo Blues as his theme song when he was still fronting Prairie Home Companion. Essentially, he was singing a Spencer Williams song. It was modified somewhat, particularly the lyrics, but he would open every show with a Spencer Williams song. Also in Chicago, 1919, Spencer Williams had the start of a relationship that was probably the most significant relationship in his songwriting career. He hooked up with a guy by the name of Clarence Williams that we talked about 2 weeks ago in a lot more detail. Just to recap, Clarence Williams was a band leader, an artistic director, a songwriter, and most importantly, a publisher, especially for our story that we're talking about tonight. He started the Williams and Perrone Publishing Company here in New Orleans with A.J. Perrone, moved it up to Chicago, and then when he migrated to New York City, he rebranded it eventually as the Clarence Williams Music Publishing Company, essentially bought out A.J. Perrone. And he and Spencer Williams either wrote or Clarence published a bunch of Spencer Williams songs. There's a small partial list right there, but the first 3 songs they collaborated on, Royal Garden Blues, I Ain't Gonna Give You None of This Jelly Roll, and Yama Yama Blues, hit and hit pretty hard, enough that it changed Spencer Williams' perception of himself. Up until 1918, he continued to identify himself as a Pullman porter. We know that from his 1918 draft card. That's how he identified his profession. And once he hits on this stuff with Clarence Williams, then it's no more Pullman porter. He is basically a songwriter at that point. Royal Garden Blues is probably the most significant of the 3. had a lot of recordings. It gets played today. You can go down and walk through the streets of New Orleans and you can hear this song played. But probably the most significant recording was from 1921 by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. They are the band from New Orleans that is credited with having the first jazz recordings. That was 1917, a 78 of Livery Stable Blues and Dixie Jazz Band One Step. And because they had the first jazz recordings out there, individually, some of them are selling hundreds of thousands of copies, they established a lot of the repertoire. So that's part of what they did for Royal Garden Blues, was bring it into the traditional and all the revival canons. So that's the original Dixieland Jazz Band from 1921. Lots of other versions of this. No surprise, Louis Armstrong did it, Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, Bix Beiderbecke, Bob Crosby Orchestra. So it had life over a couple of generations of the evolution of jazz. And like I said, it still gets played today, at least here in New Orleans. I Ain't Give You Nobody None of This Jelly Roll was another interesting number of the three that was a hit. Among other people, Sidney Bechet recorded it. This is Sidney over here on the left. Mamie Smith's Jazz Hounds, she was an early blues pioneer. Jimmy Davis recorded it. Jimmy Davis. That's Louisiana Governor Jimmy Davis recorded this song. Yama Yama Blues got some traction. Among others, Clarence Williams himself recorded it with his Washboard 4. This Washboard band, you can see the washboard over here on the right in the picture below. That was one of the major variations he did with the bands he ran. His jazz band was typically known as Clarence Williams Blue 5, no drummer. But when he did his washboard bands, he typically had the washboard as a percussionist. He used the washboard much, much more, enormously more than he ever used a drummer in any of his, or most of his jazz ensembles. So Spencer goes to New York, 1921, winter of 1921, and leverages his connections with Clarence Williams and has some success fairly quickly in musical theater. There was a show that started off called Chocolate Brown, wound up being called Put and Bake, and played briefly at the Town Hall Theater. He had songs placed in that. It probably didn't last very long because of racial prejudices. But in 1921, in the fall, it toured, and through that, he met a guy by the name of Perry Bradford, who was an early blues impresario. That's Perry up in the upper left. Got some work in the passing show of 1922, specifically a song called Got to Cool My Doggies Now, which became Fats Waller's first recorded piano roll in 1923. Fats Waller, of course, is a very iconic piano player, stride piano player, songwriter, singer, performer. And he got some songs placed in Tan Town Topics, although that really didn't get produced until 1926. It was in a generation earlier than that. And that was two Fats Waller songs with Spencer Williams lyrics, Senorita Mine and Charleston Hound. And this was part of this long-running songwriting collaboration that he had with Fats Waller. Fats Waller did early piano rolls, Haitian Blues and Snake Hips. Together, they co-composed a bunch of stuff in 1924 around blues themes, Bloody Razor Blues, Bullet Wound Blues, and of course, the Tan Town Topics, 1946. 1924, he had another hit, Everybody Loves My Baby. And that took off, man, that just went zooming. 1924 in the summer, Georgia Melodians, 2 shows he gets it in. In November of 1924, there are 3 recordings with kind of musicians running in the same circle. The Red Onion Jazz Babies with a vocal by Alberta Hunter, who's an early blues singer. So the Red Onion Jazz Babies is another Clarence Williams project. It featured Louis Armstrong on trumpet and his wife Lil on piano, and frequently had Sidney Bechet as the soprano sax player. And these were some of the first recordings with Armstrong and Bechet playing together. And the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra with Louis Armstrong singing did the song. This was in a period, 1924, 1925, when Louis Armstrong was in New York and playing with the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. That's him in the picture in the middle, in the trumpet section. And then Clarence Williams also recorded with his Blue Five behind his wife, Eva Taylor. And you can see both Alberta Hunter and Eva Taylor are referenced in the advertisement for the song on the left that Clarence Williams Music Publishing placed. But the song just goes on and on. Trixie Smith records it twice. In 1925, the Boswell sisters recorded it in the early 1930s. I think it was 1932. Then there's a whole bunch of Victor recordings. The Earl Hines Orchestra. So we talked about Earl Hines already, his significance. Lionel Hampton, who was a drummer and a vibes player. And again, Fats Waller's name is showing up. Fletcher Henderson got a lot of traction with Spencer Williams songs. Specifically, he used him in his band when he had Louis Armstrong singing some of the songs. And he did a lot of work accompanying singers, either as a piano player or using part of his band. And they're drawing on the Spencer Williams catalog extensively. And so Fletcher Henderson, why do we care about Fletcher Henderson? Just, okay, he's associated with Spencer Williams. But he was a fairly big deal in that he was the music director for most of the life of Black Swan Records. It didn't last very long, at least in its original incarnation. That was a very significant early label because it was Black owned, featured Black performers, and targeted for a Black market. It was the first label that satisfied all those criteria. So that was part of the race market. It wasn't until 1924 when he started his own performing bands. He had bands, but they were recording bands before that. So he was one of the early swing bands and had some iconic people. Louis Armstrong, Coleman Hawkins, was a legendary tenor saxophone player that spanned multiple generations, and arrangers Don Redman, Betty Carter. And then he wound up himself doing arrangements for Benny Goodman. His band had some financial hard times, so he would sell arrangements to Benny Goodman that he had used for his orchestra. And then at one point, basically sold most of his book, or his book of arrangements, to Benny Goodman, and then became a staff arranger. So he wasn't the only guy that did arrangements for Benny Goodman, but to a large extent, when you think of the sound of the Benny Goodman band, it's the sound of Fletcher Henderson. It's Fletcher Henderson arrangements. So Spencer has his first sojourn away from the United States, 1924, 1928, because he gets recruited to be the music director and the band leader for a show that's going to be staged in Paris called the La Revue Nerka. And that is known basically for the thing that exploded Josephine Baker's career. She was known for dancing almost naked in a banana skirt. And that's one of the versions of banana skirt on the right there, the upper right. So where's my cursor? And it's also one of the rare instances where Spencer Williams is actually working. I mean, he's writing songs, but he's working really as a music director and a band leader. Josephine Baker had an established career. She was in the touring company of Shuffle Along, and then got onto the New York City run of Chocolate Dandies, enough that she got identified as that comedy chorus girl. But Williams sort of discovered her, at least as far as the Revue Negra is concerned, in that he brought her to the attention of the producer, and she was cast, and her career just exploded. And he continued to mentor her on her successful career. Eventually, she became the headliner at the Folies Bergère in Paris. Some of the stuff that Spencer contributed to the show included songs like Danse Sauvage, Charleston Cabaret, and Sidney Bechet was in the band for the show. Sidney Bechet had also kind of fled the United States, and he spent much of his life as an expat over in Europe, and the French just fell in love with him. So the show plays at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, goes to the Théâtre de l'Étiole, and then it winds up touring in early 1926, Brussels, Belgium, Berlin. Well, after his association with the show ends, Spencer Williams stays in Europe for a while. He liked the idea that there was much less racism there. I don't want to say there was none, but he wasn't dealing with it like he would have had to deal with it in the United States. And he wound up being a figure at a lot of clubs run by Bricktop Smith, who was actually from West Virginia and became a celebrity in Paris. In succession, the Music Box, the Montmartre Club in Paris, the Grand Duc Café near the Moulin Rouge, and again, Sidney Bechet surfaces as the band leader for the Moulin Rouge. While he's in Europe, he's still having domestic success. 1926, he gets listed as the band and orchestra manager for Clarence Williams Publishing Company. It's not clear exactly why that happened because he's clearly not there and he's not acting as a band and orchestra manager. It was probably an association that they made to benefit both of them. So Spencer gets prestige by being associated with the publishing company, and Clarence Williams, the publishing company, gets prestige by being associated with Spencer Williams. I Found a New Baby has success. It's written with the lyricist Jack Palmer, a white guy, gets into the Tantown Topics. Clarence Williams Blue 5 records it. And he continues doing Josephine Baker songs for publication. And he also has 3 songs placed in a theatrical show, Bottomland, from 1927, which was a Clarence Williams show that just didn't last very long. I think it actually had a run of less than a month. 1928 has his return to New York. And this is the start of what I refer to as the Storyville trifecta. That's my description of it. He wound up writing a bunch of songs that reference Storyville. Basin Street Blues, Mahogany Hall Stomp, one that was called Good Time Flat Blues that became better known as Farewell or Goodbye to Storyville. And then later you'll see some other ones down below that he wrote, most of them directly related to Storyville, although there's one that's kind of loosely associated, where Carnival dances at the Mardi Gras. And that picture on this slide, that is from a postcard of what's called Up the Line on Basin Street. It's essentially the 200 block of Basin Street from Bienville looking up toward Canal Street. And that brownish building on the right, that is Luther White's Mahogany Hall. Of all of these songs, I would call Basin Street Blues his legacy song. It's a 1928 composition, and Louis Armstrong actually records it that year. Although, I mean, it's recognizable as Basin Street Blues, but it's nothing like the song form that we think of now. It's got a verse consisting of a 12-bar blues form. It is not the verse that we think of now. It's associated with Basin Street Blues. And in the recording, and probably the original composition, it did not have any words. So I'm going to play this version for you. There's a funny kind of, almost like a glockenspiel sounding instrument. It's a celeste that is being played by Earl Hines. This is Earl Hines on the piano now. So that, of course, was Louis Armstrong with the scat vocal there. So the song is recognizable as Basin Street Blues, but it's basically because you got the chorus. It doesn't become what we know in its form as Basin Street Blues until 1931 with a recording by the Charleston Chasers, or credited to the Charleston Chasers. They're mostly members of Ben Pollock Band that are working in New York City. And they hook up with Jack Teagarden and do this session. So the Charleston Chasers never actually played anywhere. This is only a studio band for the purposes of recording. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, who were members of the Ben Pollock Band, and Jack Teagarden. And Teagarden claims that Glenn Miller did the arrangement and added what we now know as the verse, essentially the opening part of Basin Street Blues. And he, Teagarden and Miller, created the words. And it became a signature song for Jack Teagarden. He had played it for his whole career. And essentially they never, or sorry, I can't say never, they rarely get credit for their contribution to it.
Won't you come along with me? Of me. Thanks on me. You're
So the classic arrangement that we know of Basin Street Blues had a really interesting history, or has a really interesting history of sustained popularity. 1928, 1929, it's recorded late 1928, released early 1928 by Armstrong. So that's the only recording from the 20s. The 30s, you get 8 recordings, including the Charleston Chasers. And it's probably not taken off a lot because you're now deep in the depth of the Depression. 1940s, you've got the war, you've got recording bands, so it gets recorded, but not a lot. But in the 1950s, this thing explodes. Secondhand Records lists 22 recordings, 1960s, 23, 1970s, 18, 1980s, 22, 1990s, 23 recordings. And then the biggest year in terms of numbers of recordings is the beginning of the 2000s. I mean, it's a new millennium when this thing is still peaking. Some of the high profile performers that did it, Ray Charles and Sam Cooke. Miles Davis did it. The guy who is probably the most high profile modernist has a version of it on an album called 7 Steps to Heaven. There's a couple of Western swing versions. Bob Wills did it, which would be a vintage version. And Sleep at the Wheel had a more recent one when they went and had Leon Rausch record with them, who was an old Texas playboy. And then pop singers did it. You got Patti Page, Peggy Lee, Dean Martin, Liza Minnelli doing this thing. And some of the really interesting ones, if you look down at the bottom, it was the first tune recorded by Charlie Parker. So he's like the king of the beboppers. He's not the only guy that invented bebop music, but he's probably the most high profile one. His early career was with the Jay McShann Band, and he records this tune in 1940. And then Kenny Clark, who's probably the original bebop drummer. His nickname was actually Klukamop, because they said the way he played drums, it wasn't just timekeeping, it sounded like Klukamop. He recorded the tune in 1938, it's the first tune he records. So this Basin Street Blues permeates everything. And there's a lot of local performers that did it. You got Harry Connick up on the right. Dr. John put it on his classic Going Back to New Orleans album. Banu Gibson, Lars Edegren. And then one of my favorites is right down here at the bottom. It was even featured in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which we know was filmed significantly in New Orleans. Mahogany Hall Stomp is the second of the what I call the Storyville trifecta. It was written specifically named for Mahogany Hall. That's the image of Mahogany Hall on the right. There's the transom that was salvaged, Lulu White's, and the black and white photo on the bottom is the parlor from Mahogany Hall. So that, of course, was Louis Armstrong playing trumpet there. And Jason noticed it was Paul Barberin playing the drums, another iconic New Orleans musician. And then we're down to Good Time Flat Blues, which is one of my favorites because it got included in a movie from 1947 just called New Orleans. That's where it picked up the name Farewell or Goodbye to Storyville. I think that the title is really Farewell to Storyville, but people refer to it as Goodbye to Storyville. So this movie is a highly, 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 highly fictionalized version of the end of Storyville. And I think it's the only movie that actually featured Louis Armstrong in a film together with Billie Holiday in very, very iconic band. And so the song was used in the sequence where they're actually shutting down Storyville. And I love this section of the film. So I'm actually going to play it for you in total. Sorry, I got to change my screen sharing here. Can y'all see the... I love that because, I mean, we all know, right? That's how Storyville ended, where the police came in and blew the whistle and everybody came out with their mattresses and whatever. It's just, the movie's not that, sorry, the movie's not great, but it's not so painful that you couldn't watch the whole thing if you wanted to. Just a hoot. So Spencer in his later years, he goes back to Paris again, 1932, 1935, winds up in London starting in 1936. He gets married to an English woman by the name of Agnes Moore Babe, who has a performing career as Pat Castleton, two daughters, Lindy and Virginia Della. And it's during this period that Spencer claimed to be the inspiration for Sam. That's Dooley Wilson's character in Casablanca. That's the picture right there. I have no idea if that's true. You know, it might have been a figment of Spencer's imagination. I did come back to New York for another 4-year period. Really didn't have any commercial success. You know, mostly his career as a songwriter is over. And then goes to Sweden, 1951 and 1957, and actually has some financial success from revival of old copyrights. His older songs resurface, particularly I Ain't Got Nobody, of course, and Royal Garden Blues. And then in 1957, he returned to Queens and his failing health, and he died in 1965. If you want to pursue Mr. Williams in more detail to learn some of the things about him, these would be some of the sources I would suggest. There's a good online source on this ragpiano.com website Bill Edwards is the guy that maintains it, and he writes a lot of biographical material. And I think his section on Williams is particularly good because he's the one that doesn't really share the whole mythology about being born in New Orleans and living in Storyville when his mother died. And I always do a plug for the discography of American Historical Recordings. It covers a lot of songwriters and performers. They focus mostly on 78s, but the Spencer Williams catalog there is really good, 530 something maybe. And again, they focus mostly on 78s, and I think the discography runs up to maybe 1949, so it doesn't even include everything. And there's 2 compilations, a bunch of shorter pieces, Spreading Rhythm Around. The section on Spencer Williams is pretty interesting. And Gary Giddens has a book called Visions of Jazz, where he talks about Spencer Williams. He tends to be a little more, I don't know, philosophical in his writing than maybe the Jason and Jones book does, but it's still got some interesting stuff. And so the legacy lives on with Spencer Williams songs, and this really isn't even a lot of them. Sorry. My screen went dark here. So I'll be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, we have a couple people on here. See if they either can put them in the chat if they have any questions, or if they want to, they might be able to unmute themselves. David, let me get started off with, when you mentioned that he later on had somewhat of a financial kind of boom a little bit with later on. I mean, he had classic songs that were recorded for a long time. Did that, when you say that, did that mean, do you mean that there weren't a lot, he did not get paid for a long time, or get access to funds that he, rightfully deserved, but just because of the way the industry was built by that time?
Right. So he probably did have some financial success during that period, but it's doubtful that all the royalties actually made it to him. I mean, we know the history of the music business is that there was a lot of money that never made it to the artists. It wasn't unique to him, and it wasn't unique to his generation. It just was a multi-generational problem in the music industry.
Gotcha. Thank you. And if anybody else has a question, I love this Storyville because it's so great, because it's like, I'm sure that's the way I'm sure that's how it happened. They just walked out. That was the end of it.
There's a quote from it. I can't remember if it's the Navy guy or a police captain, what it is, but I used to have a quote on my signature in my email where he makes this pronouncement about Storyville, description of Storyville at one point, and he goes something like 37 blocks of sin and degradation, and the way I count it, it's 12 blocks, maybe if you're generous, maybe you give it 15 or 16. So I love this whole 37 block thing. It took over half of New Orleans, I guess. So not a factual movie. We want to be clear to people, not a factual movie.
You're there for the music.
Right. It's a fun story. What the heck?
So I want to thank Dave so much, and I want to thank you all for attending today. And if you, as always, we'll be sending you the link to tomorrow for it. And Dave, I want to thank you for taking the time to do all this, and really appreciate you doing this. And
Hey, Gordon.
A really fantastic lecture.
Thanks, Dave. That was great.
You're welcome. Glad you made it back in time so you could see the presentation. Gordon was on the road for 6 weeks, maybe. I don't know.
Also, I'd like to point out, when you were talking about the misinformation about birthplace, I was just looking up in Apple Music, and Apple Music actually has a piece here about Spencer Williams, talks a little bit about him, says here he was born in New Orleans, but it also says his genre is country. So they obviously don't get everything right.
Oh, that's hysterical. I mean, what I love that period, there was so much overlap: blues, jazz, musical theater, popular music. But There was no country there. Other than maybe the Clarence Williams washboard stuff, maybe you could say, but that was about as close as you came. That's really funny. I did not see that. That's hysterical.
Well, thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Dave, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. And we look forward to seeing you next week, same time with Bill Capo. So thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody.